So good morning, my name's Scott, I'm one of the pastors here, and it is really good to be with you today. So this series, somebody asked me, so how's the series been going for you guys, and what are your thoughts on it? And we have these seasons of series that we do here, some that are maybe much more sort of heartfelt, maybe more relationship-centric, like we do our Stogies and Stilettos series. Kind of the first part of the year, we talk about dating and love and sex and all those good things, and that's something, at some level, probably everybody in this space is having to contend with some of those realities, and so there's a sense that, that makes sense, and we all live in that world. Or maybe we're doing a series on forgiveness, and so some of these heartfelt series, and then we do these series like we're in now, where they're a little bit of a forming series. They're a little bit of a cultural piece. They're a little bit of a piece that helps you and I associate with the journey that we're on. We kind of try to clarify and call out where we're going as a community or as a church. Maybe in that space, in this, like a series like this, you resonate with it because it's giving you some handles to express your journey. And I think that's been part of it. That's been, many of you over the years have said, you got to better define what we're experiencing here, guys. You got to help us understand what's going on. And frankly, we just don't always know what's going on. So it's hard to always define that, right? Or the journey that we are on is so editing, it's so shifting, it's changing all the time. So it's really hard sometimes to say, now let's say this is the new sort of foundation, or this is the new truth, or this is a piece that we hold to. So this series that we're playing with is trying to give you guys just that. We're trying to give you guys some handles of which we have been holding to for dear life for the last couple of years ourselves. And so this series has more of a technical side to it, of which we only got a couple weeks left. Let me identify generally the journey that most of us in this space have been on at some level. I know many of you personally. I've had many lunches and coffees with many of you, and I've heard you kind of identify your story and your experience similar to what I'm going to identify it as for you in just a moment. For many of us in this space, we didn't leave our previous church environments necessarily because we're mad or we're angry. Now that might have been true for some of you, or maybe something went south with the leadership of that church or what have you. But for the most part, many of you, your stories of why you've left the space that you are in is because you argue that the questions that you've been asking were not allowed in that space. That you might begin to question why things are in terms of faith in God and the trajectory of the scriptures, the trajectory of your own journey, the story that is Christianity, that is Judaism, because we're a sect of Judaism. We've come out of that. All those stories, all those conversations that maybe you've held to as sort of this is the way it is, and there's a sense of clarity in the minds of those previous church expressions, you were finding they were no longer clear for you. That maybe they were saying, well, every story in the Bible, it happened very literally, and there's no metaphor, there's no imagery, and you say, but I don't know if that could always necessarily be true, and you begin to ask questions about how you peel away the scriptures. And all of a sudden, the containers that you once held to, you began asking more and more and more questions, and those questions were not offering, or at least the spaces that you were in before, we're not receiving satiating answers. There was more angst and there was more frustration, and there was frustration on the part of the people that you were asking the questions of because you were messing with their foundation, their core tenets. And so then you found yourself saying, I'm not sure I can be in this space, not because I'm mad or angry, not because I don't love the people, but because they weren't willing to dance with the questions that maybe you are finding yourself living in these days. And so here at Watershed, we've been dancing with a lot of these questions for a long time, and that question-asking process that sends you into a space, often a tailspin, because that was my journey. Everyone on our staff have experienced this very, very directly, where we had this sort of tailspin of spirituality, like, wait a minute, God, I thought you were all these nice, neat things, and you're not. What does that mean for us now? And you find yourself in this tailspin questioning everything that you've once held to the point where you're not sure if you believe any of it anymore. There's a philosophical term called deconstruction. We've talked about that quite a bit here. That you begin asking yourself so many questions and you have no answers, and so you just land in this space that no longer really exists in terms of quality of experience for you because you don't know anything to be true anymore. At some point, though, you kind of bottom out, kind of land, and you begin this new journey, this new sort of reconstruction, this new sense of optimism and hope. Because here's the reality of it. You're not necessarily running from God. I argue most of us have never really run from God. We probably were running from the church experience, the guilt, the rules. That's different than not connecting with God. I surmise that every one of you in this space longs for a connection with God. And even though you're asking all those questions, and even though you've peeled away so much of the roots that you were told matter so significantly, you've let those go and you've kind of rebounded into a new space that says, I don't know exactly what the future holds, but my pursuit of God still stands strong. And there's a sense of hope. There's a sense of optimism. There's a sense of freedom. There's a sense of discovery, the newness, this reality that whatever is out there, it might actually be bigger than anything I've ever experienced before. And so let's go try to figure out what that looks like. And instead of running away from any kind of organized religiosity completely, you say, you know what, no, I want to circle the wagons with some friends, with some people who are on that same journey. And what we can do in mass is so much more profound than what you can do as an individual. And thus the community that is Watershed. Thus that is our journey right now. And so what you see on the screen right now, this post-church conversation has been really the story of many of us in this room. We're not angry at God. We're maybe not even angry at I'm grateful for my upbringing. I'm grateful for the churches I grew up in. Those places deeply cared for me. They gave me opportunities to experiment and to play and to try to figure out what God looked like. And I feel like at times they just didn't allow us to ask the questions. And so I began to kind of veer off from that. But I'm so grateful for it, but I could never go back to it. No desire whatsoever. I don't mind being post-evangelical, post-Catholic, post-Jewish, post-Hindu, post-Muslim. I don't care, whatever you want to call yourself. I am finding more and more people who grew up in those infrastructures and those systems that would not allow you to play and to edit and discover God, often are saying, I want out. And we're here to say, what's it look like to gather as a spiritual community that still longs for justice to be realized, longs for people to be helped that are hurting, longs for marriages to be better than they were before, and what's it mean to raise up children in this sort of newfound post-church narrative. And it's something we're playing with and we're discovering and trying to figure out what that looks like. How is it that we raise up young men and women who take God seriously and we give them the ways to play that you and I never had to play? And so that's what this series is really about. And what we've done is this. Many of you have been saying, all right, I get it. We've deconstructed, we've broken things down, we've reconstructed all. That's fine. But what are the things that we do take bullets for around here? What are the things that we hold to? What are the handles that we are going to grab onto and say, all right, let's go for a ride? There's probably 20 or 30 things we could have this conversation about, but for this series, we've chosen to grab 8. To play with 8 of them. Will these ebb and flow and shift over the months and years? Absolutely. Will there be a different way of looking at all of them? Absolutely. We've talked about liberation and solidarity and justice and awareness and generosity. And each of those are loaded terms that if you really want to hear about more of who we are and who we're becoming, but those are crucial words that are so meaningful and deep for us here. And so we've got really 2 more weeks. But today, I want to talk about this piece that I think is maybe the closest to who we are internally. It's this conversation about identity. And again, when we start talking identity, I think it means so many different things to so many different people. So here's how I want to start it out. I want to tell you a story if I can. So about 3 years ago, my family went to this festival called Leaf. And if you're familiar with it, it's outside of Asheville. It's this music festival, and it's a bunch of people, a bunch of hippies, like, I don't know, 1,000 people or whatever. So, and a bunch of you are there. I walk into Watershed people all the time. You're all there and having a good old time and acting like you're hippies, but you're not, but acting like it. I get it. You put on the garb, the whole deal. And we've got this old 68 Airstream, and so we set it up there, and we just have a great time. It's a family time. And my youngest son, Keen, loves poetry. The school and the teachers that he has had, for whatever reason, just happened to play out, and they go to a Montessori school. Poetry was a big piece of their education. So Keen would memorize poems for events that we would have, Christmas events or whatever it might be. And so poetry was always a part of his learning experience, his value. We went to this Leaf Festival 3 years ago for the first time, and come to find out they have a slam poetry competition for teenagers. So Keen decided he wanted to go see that, so we go as a family, and there's a bunch of teenagers doing slam poetry, which was unbelievably awesome. So cool. The person facilitating it says, do we have any other poets out here that would like to be a part of this teenage experience? And Keen says to us, well, I'd like to do my poem. Well, son, you're 8 years old. It's just probably not going to work, but we'll ask. So I walked up and, would you mind letting my son do his poem? Yeah, no problem. Again, a bunch of hippies, they don't care, right? Doesn't matter, no schedule, no agenda. So he goes up on stage and he kills it. He goes to the second round, and he had to write a poem because he didn't have one that he had remembered and memorized. So he wrote a poem in between, and so he made it to the second round. That was 3 years ago. Last year, he made it to first runner-up because he came with 3 prepared poems. This year, he won it. Last Saturday night, that was him on stage. Yeah, right? He killed it. So, and one of the benefits of winning at the teen level, of which he's only 11 if you do your math, so he's still pretty young, he did a great job with it. Then they have him that night go to the adult one. And so there's like 600-700 people packed in this room, and this, I don't know if you've ever been a part of a slam poetry experience. Maybe the single most moving experience of my life. Because you get these people that have some kind of soul-wrenching experience. They go up on stage and they share their heart, and they pour out with beautiful language and poetry and rhythm what they've experienced, and it's just so moving. So anyways, we were there for that, but they had Keen open it up, and he stood up in front of those 600-700 people, and as only hippie adults do, like, yeah, rah, rah, great job. He loved it, came off, he just was flying high. So he's this, in one sense, he has as an identity a poet. The 48 hours later, so that was last Saturday night, Monday night, 48 hours later, I took him to his first Metallica concert. And here he is at the Spectrum Center. Now, I know from a parenting standpoint, it probably was not my highest call, was not the best decision. And we select the songs that he can listen to on his iPod. And so for the words and the language and for the obvious reasons. And so he's like, oh, Dad, all these are new songs they've got that they're playing. Well, they're songs that he's never heard before. But we're at this space. I don't know if you've ever been to a Metallica concert. I have not been to one. Last I knew, it was illegal to smoke in buildings, but not at a Metallica concert. And the things they were smoking were more than just cigarettes and cigars, as you can imagine, passing it around. I mean, there was not a sober person around us except Keen and I. And however, Keen he was completely focused on that stage. He was obsessed. So he literally plays, it's School of Rock, it's a local killer music experience here where he plays in a rock band. So he knows these songs, he plays these songs. And so within a 48-hour period of time, Keen is experiencing this sort of hippie poem, emotive, living off the land kind of disposition in the sticks and the woods. And then all of a sudden he's uptown in the throes of fire and smoke and screaming and hollering. And it was an amazing 2-day experience. And so if you were to say to Keen, who are you? He would say, he might say a whole bunch of things. He might say, I'm a poet, probably say, I'm a rocker. Dad, I like to play the guitar, and I like Legos, and I'm a son, and I'm a brother. He might say some of those things, but those aren't who he is. I think it's important that we understand that. Early in life, we identify with the things that we can touch and that we can see, then do. It matters that when we see something or do something, we somehow say that is us. That is a story that typically plays out for us earlier on in the journey, earlier on in life. I think Jesus sometimes really gets at this quite elegantly, quite beautifully, as he tells these different stories in the Gospels. And so I want to read this one. Well, let me back up. Before I go there, I think it's important also to understand, we ask the question often, who am I? What's my identity? Who I am and what I do are different things. A personality, that is really what you do. That's the stuff you spend your day doing. That is associated with your personality. You are funny, or you like to do poetry, or you're creative. That's a personality-driven thing. Now again, this is a soft science, so there's obviously debate in all this. But who you are, the question you might ask is, what is my identity? Addresses the question, who am I? Who is that most core person? You remove everything. If you could somehow remove every piece of identity that is you, if you could remove the sense that you are a brother or a son or a daughter or a wife or a mother or whatever your professions, if you could push those all aside, that core essence, that is your identity. Who you are with everything being gone in God's presence is the most you. Because the essence of the universe who made you, and when you can push away all the noise, that is who you are. So we spend a lot of time here talking about trying to push away the noise and push away the stuff and get rid of all the volume out there. Because here's what's happened in our traditional faith experiences. You were told that you needed to do all these things. You got to read your Bible a certain way. You got to pray a certain way. That you have to attend church a certain way. You have to do all these sort of things. And in doing all of that, you were given sort of these badges that said, oh, you are somehow more spiritual. You are somehow closer to God. You are somehow a better person. Actually, the irony of it is, it seems as though what Jesus is inviting us into is actually to remove those things, to push those things aside, not to identify with all of these things that we somehow think are us. Those are personality things. Those are things that you do and touch and see. Those aren't things that are you. I think it's important that we understand this. In the progressive space, we're trying to minimalize spirituality. In terms of the volume of stuff that's the noise. We want to push things away and say, all right, what does it mean for me ultimately to rest with God? How do I do that? What's that begin to look like? How do I play with that? And it's something that is not intuitive to us because as Americans, we're productive. Like Austin was saying, we get stuff done. We got checklists. And checklists for us are often adding stuff to who we are as opposed to pushing it aside and saying who I am and what I do are not the same thing. But most of us cannot do that, at least early on in our life. So I'm going to take you to Luke 14. Jesus said this story. A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to those who've been invited. Come, for everything is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, I just bought a field, and I must go and see it. Please excuse me. Another said, I just bought 5 oxen. I am on my way out to them. Please excuse me. Still another said, I just got married, so I can't come. So these are people that are very much involved in what they do. They're associating their doingness as somehow being a profound value. I work the land, I've got animals, I've got a family. Those things are significant to these first 3 people. Verse 21, the servant came back and reported this to the master. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered the servant, go out quickly into the streets and the alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. And these people show up to this event, the story goes on to say. Interestingly enough, if you look at the 2 groups that Jesus is talking about here, the first group are 3 different individuals who identify with their things. They identify with their status as a family member or their ownership of an animal or their ownership of a land. That is who they are, and that's how they identify themselves, so much so that they can't be a part of this grand party, this grand experience. But then the second group of people, these are in terms of socioeconomic status, they're a little bit on the lower rung of this deal. This group arguably has been broken. They're sick, lame. They've probably had to beg. They probably are spit upon. They clearly are looked down as being a second-class citizen within the Jewish culture and with the Roman culture that they are around. And they have a different sense of how they see themselves for one specific reason, because they've been broken, because their world's been turned upside down. In one sense, the other 3 are just busy doing sort of stuff that they identify with that really fundamentally doesn't matter. And the poor and the lame, the hurting who show up to this party are sitting there in a space that they identify themselves differently because of just the raw brokenness that they have. They aren't even giving us sort of a title of what they do. They just are given a title of they're sick or they have an ailment, but they have no sort of identity in doing one thing. They just are something. That there is this sense that the broken, that the lame, that the hurting, they have this awareness of who they are in that space. And their space of identity has been sort of reinforced because they've been broken. So hang with me here. Maybe it'll make a little bit more sense. I want to take you down a little bit of a journey that, again, I'm generalizing, but I argue it's something that most of us experience in our lifetime. And I call this identity development. In the space of identity development, we come up with an identity. Early on in life, you have an identity. Maybe you're the proverbial rock star or the poet, right? Or maybe you're the athlete, or maybe you're really good at school, or maybe you don't like the way you look and other friends and people made fun of you, and so you identify with those things, and those kind of tapes are playing in your head. Or maybe in your school setting that something happened and you created an identity in that space, or maybe your parents didn't make it in their marriage, and so you were identified as the kid that had the broken family. Who knows, right? But you have this identity. It's something all of us do early on. We think, in terms of that identity, it's the doing and being thing all kind of, it's a big old hairball all together. Even though it separates as we progress, early on, who you are is also marked by what you do and what you touch and what you see and what you're experiencing. Invariably, you have a loss and a pain happen. So you might identify with being an athlete in high school. You go off to college, maybe you play some great school, and you blow out your knee your freshman year, and now how you identify is no longer as an athlete. That's pain, that's loss. And now how you play sports resets. You have a revised identity. You might not identify with being an athlete anymore, but you identify with having played a sport. So what begins to happen is your identity of what you do and who you are begin to ever so gently separate. This is a life pursuit. This is kind of a lifelong journey. And you have this revised identity, and then invariably you have loss and pain once again, and you begin a new identity after that. This revised journey of identity, loss and pain, revised identity, is a cycle that all of us experience at different levels. And it continues on indefinitely. This might play out in your career. I'll use a banker as an illustration because we have plenty of you who are bankers. You graduate from a good school and you start your career at 22, and before you know it, 10, 15 years into this thing, you are doing really, really well. Your managers are grateful for the role that you play. Maybe you've been given some leadership in there. Your pay has gone up. Your bonuses have gone up. You identify as this banker. You're in there early in the morning till late at night. There's even talk of maybe you going to New York and working the trading floor in New York. And so all of this, like this identity that you are as a banker is everything for you right now. And you are enjoying thoroughly this role that you are getting to play. All of a sudden, it's 2008, the downturn happens, and your job goes away. That what you've understood is so meaningful, what you've understood to be who you are now is completely gone. And 6, 8, 12 months later, you find another job, but maybe it's a job doing something not quite like what you were doing before. Maybe you took a pay cut. Maybe maybe it was a lateral move. I don't know, whatever it might have been. But what begins to happen now, this side of a revised identity, you look at your career differently. You hold it a little bit more loosely. You might not identify with being a banker because you lost it. And maybe you've got another job in that industry, but your association with it, you hold it again, more gently. You might not see it as that's fully exactly who you are. And so you begin to find that playing out in other areas of life. Maybe you're a spouse, and you've identified so much as being that husband or a wife or that partner, and for years that has been you. And all of a sudden, he or she, they have that affair. And that person is now out of your life. And what you've identified as, no longer you are that. You are no longer the spouse. You are no longer the husband or the wife. That is completely gone. And then years or months go on, and you start to date again, and you engage in another relationship. But you hold that relationship a little bit at bay in terms of how you identify with it. I mean, you serve it well, you love that person, you treat that person well, but you quickly come into this space that says, wait a minute, I can't so over-identify in that role, because in doing so, I might lose that person, and then I experience major pain, major loss. So the more you and I identify with something that we do or something that we can see, and we have the potential of losing that, the greater the pain. Do you see that? So the more identifications that you have. So I identify with my car. I identify with my neighborhood. I identify with my house. I identify with my career. I identify with my school. And if I identify with being a father, I identify with being a husband. If there's a chance that goes away, the more things I identify with, the more things I stick my hooks into and say, this is me, the chance of greater pain is going to happen to you, because you have a greater chance of losing those things. Invariably, you're going to lose some of those things, and in doing so, you feel like you are dying little deaths. So the question is is there a way that we can somehow be in those things? Is there a way that I can be a dad and a husband and a pastor? But if somehow in tragic ways those things were to go away, is who I am tied up in those that I somehow lose my identity? Or is there a way to say, no, my identity transcends those? I mean, obviously I'm informed by the things that I do, but who I am is not what I do. Easier said than done. It's part of the journey that we find ourselves going down. So there's this identity development narrative. It's a lifetime story. It's a lifetime experience. It's something that we do over a period of lifetime. And we will have this happen multiple times, sometimes simultaneously in multiple areas. I talked to a friend of mine earlier, and there's chaos in family, chaos in life work, and chaos in some personal areas, and there's a whole new learning, a whole new resetting going on. And it's probable the other side of some of this struggle that's currently happening, there will be a new revised identity, and probably this person will hold less to some of those things that once were seemingly informing who he thought he was, but really those are just variables that are not necessarily his identity. I've got the privilege of still having two grandmothers in my life. I believe they're both right at 94, and there's amazing women. The one grandmother I'm talking about now, she helped us start Watershed. She was a part of our core team when she was 80, and so, which is really cool. And she gives $100 to this community, has done so for years, and believes in it, even though she can't physically be here anymore with us. So right now, she's been living on her own up to this point, and as a family, we've decided to place her in a home right near where we all live, so we can still visit her, but this home can really meet the needs that she has, and great community and all of that. And so our family was literally sitting in her house. We're in the process of selling that. It was sitting in her house 2 Saturdays ago, and we're sitting around the house in the space and just enjoying the company of being with somebody who's lived for 94 years, who's seen it all. And she's literally pointing at things and giving them away to all of us. Like that desk, I got this little writer's desk from her that was her grandfather's. It was my great-grandfather's desk. It was 100 plus years old. And that desk, I know, has meant the world to my grandmother for decades, literally. I mean, for decades. And then on the wall was a clock. My grandfather, her husband of almost 50 years, retired from DuPont decades ago. And those are the days, I guess, they would give you a clock after you gave your soul to a company, right? So he got a clock, and it chimes, right? I remember growing up with these noises of these chimes in a house, and when we'd visit, and the memories, and I got the clock, and she's just kind of giving this stuff away. Why? Because Grandma does not have identity in those things. Those things kind of don't matter anymore to her. I mean, there's memories, and she's glad that we get to have them, and we get to carry on those memories, but there's no sense of meaning in those things. And she's emptying out her house because she's not naive to, this is another stage in life. The things are changing. And she's not attached to these things. Because early on, we're deeply attached, aren't we? I mean, so we capture stuff, we collect stuff, and we gather stuff, and we live in certain places, and we do careers, and we attach to it, and we identify with it, and somehow we have this weird concoction of a journey that it is us. But when you stop and think about it, well, clearly you are more than the things that you can touch and do and see and taste and be around. And so we have this lifelong journey that we are constantly editing and creating identity and a loss and pain and the revised identity. Maybe another way I can say this, we've talked about this over the years, that early on in life we are creating a false self. It's what most of us do, and we do it most of the time unconsciously. That we are identifying, we have this sort of voice in the back that is saying, well, this is who you are. You know, Scott, you're a pastor at a church, and you're a husband, and you're a white male in a culture that, whatever that means, right? Or some of you identify you're a person of color, or you're a female, and like you've got all these noises, these tapes in your head, and somehow those things we are taught define us in this false self. It informs you in a false way. It usually happens early on in life. It happens for all of us at different times. But these tapes that are playing in our mind, these perceptions that we think we are informing how we see life. Often we don't even know what's happening. And as we age, as we go through brokenness, as we go through different identity cleansing experiences, we find ourselves coming into this sort of truer self. We wake up to a more accurate reality of who we are. That maybe power and prestige and things and career, those things just no longer seemingly carry the weight. Because we've lost them multiple times and we've gained them multiple times, and we begin to realize those things are relatively insignificant when it's all said and done. And maybe what you've begun to find is that in the quiet of your soul, in the quiet of a broken experience, you get to bump into God. And you're finding him at a place of loss, not at a place of having stuff. That you're finding him when you're invited to the table and you are broken and you feel like you've lost everything. And in that space, there's something really special. There's something really beautiful. There's something really elegant. That the truer you begins to surface. Maybe another way we can use this, and we've spent a lot of time talking about first and second half of life stuff. First half of life is when we're building things, right? We're creating. And in one sense, this is okay. It's normal. You're literally building in terms of maybe a home, your career, a family. You're creating an identity in your culture, in your neighborhood, in your city. You're finding, you're putting roots down in different places, and you're creating a sense of that's who you are. And that's part of what we do the first half of life. But invariably you bump into some type of deep pain right about midlife. We call it midlife crisis sometimes. And that deep pain could be something as simple as you wake up one day and you're so bored with work that you can hardly stand it and you can't imagine doing this for another 20 or 30 years. There could be something like that, all the way to you lose something. You lose a spouse, or you lose a child, or you lose a career, or something happens so drastic that you begin to reset and you begin to realize, wait a minute, so much of the first half of my life was building false infrastructure. It was building noise. And you begin to enter second half of life after experiencing a profound broken moment, and you begin to realize, wait a minute, I don't like my new awareness because I'm aware of brokenness in ways that I've never experienced it before. But also, there's a pursuit of a truer identity as opposed to just a beefier personality. That you find yourself maybe finding energy in discovering who you are internally as opposed to who you are externally. And that second half of life journey becomes part of the process. That maybe the truest you is when you have nothing to define you. When you have nothing else that can define you, it's the truest you. When you've lost everything, that is the most raw that you are before your Maker and before God. Just a couple verses later from the passage I just read to you that Jesus was talking the story, Luke 14, just another verse, he says this other verse. And it's kind of interesting because I'm not always sure what to do with it, but it's a very dramatic statement. He says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. Clearly, Jesus is not telling us to hate people, all right, especially our family. So we don't take this literally, that he's trying to communicate something. He's trying to communicate some kind of idea, some kind of thought. And what he is saying, I suggest, is that, listen, you associate with things in this world that fundamentally are not you. Now, loving your parents and loving your siblings, and that's valuable and we should do that, but you are not that role. Jesus is saying this. You have to disassociate with who you are and what you do are two different realities. He's being so dramatic with it. He's saying that you must view them as though you hate them, that you disregard them completely, because you are identifying with them as something that I'm not inviting you to identify with. That you are more than just a family member. He's making this kind of dramatic statement. He goes on in John 12, Jesus also says, "He who loves his life loses it." In other words, what he's saying is, if you love the attachments that you continue to invest in that first half of life, and if you're obsessed with those attachments, ultimately those attachments will haunt you, and they might sort of cease your existence, or they hamper your ability to really come to who you really are. He says, "He who loves this life loses it, and he who hates his life in this world will keep it an eternal life." This sense that if you sort of, again, dramatic statements, but if I learn to hate the things of this world, and that sounds, again, I think you can see the intensity with what Jesus is trying to say here. What he's in essence saying is, don't associate in terms of those being your identity. See them in this way that you disassociate with them. Sure, serve in those spaces, love people, care for people, be a part of people's lives, have a career, work hard, work well, buy your house, buy your car. Fine, nothing necessarily wrong with those things, but they are not you. And in the spiritual conversation, in the spiritual narrative, what does it mean for us to do the same thing in terms of our spiritual journey? And it's been almost 5 years, and I've been on this sort of deconstruction narrative of just letting so much stuff go. What if the journey of Watershed is say, you know what, all these spiritual badges that I've put on all over my body my entire life, those I've put identity in those things. I've obsessed over those things. My theological assumptions, my theological tomes on my shelf, the religious rules with which I identify with, the disciplines of the spiritual journey that I somehow feel like I'm really spiritual because I'm doing all these disciplines. What if we can actually push those away? Push those aside. And come to a space that says, who I am with God alone. That is the ultimate you. That is the ultimate me. It's why the meditation practice is so profound. Because in that space, we're literally pushing away the noise that we often arguably make our false identity. I'm pushing away the noise of my career, the noise of my to-do list. I'm pushing away that I'm a pastor at Watershed. I'm even pushing away that I'm a husband and a father as much as I value them. I'm pushing those away because when I do that, I can sit in a space like I can kind of go back to the very beginning of who I am with God. And in that space, I'm free of everything. I don't have to live up to anybody's expectations. I don't have to be somebody that I'm struggling to be or not to be. I can completely get lost in it. And what does it look like for us as a community, as a church, that more of the practice of what we do here is to push aside some of the noisy practices and do those things. So we do justice. We care for people that are hurting. Absolutely. We are to do that. That is not necessarily who you are, but you do those things. We are people that are generous. Well, absolutely we should be generous, but that's not who you are. We should invest in our kids and over in Greenhouse and our students. Absolutely. We should serve and pour into people's lives and love our families well. But that is not who you are. It's what you do. Very two different realities that our culture struggles to get our head wrapped around. And it was like Jesus was calling it out. He's saying, no, don't associate so much with even your family that you somehow think that's who you are. Because who you are is ultimately who you are alone with God. In the quiet, in the rest of that space. Richard Rohr says this: the true self is our whole self before God. The self we were created to become. Our self in Christ. These are loaded words. These are such deep, loaded words. It is the self that breathes, that stands and sits. It is the self that is. So remember the Jewish story where God is in this burning bush. And the story goes, and the people in the story say, well, God is I am there. that God is saying that is my essence. I am essence in that space. And that is the ultimate space to be, in a place of essence. That was the identity of God. The I amness of God is his identity. What is the I amness of you? Was it that God was a burning bush? Well, no, by no means. That was a container. That was what he was doing, but that wasn't who he was. Who are you at the space of when you are the most quiet with God? And in that space, there's rest. The truest rest I've ever encountered is in those moments when I am eyes closed in a space with God, and I don't have to live up to anybody else's expectations. It's so freeing. It's so elegant. And I do it imperfectly all the time, but it's one of those pursuits. And it's a single pursuit. It's not a bunch of other stuff that's coming in helping define who I am. And as a community, we get to do this together. As a community, we get to sit in a space like this and say, all right, who do we identify with? Is Watershed who you are? No. Watershed is what we get to do. But you're these men and these women in this space who God is inviting to identify with him in the quiet of your soul, in the quiet of a space with him, and become that reality in Christ. So God, in this space this morning, as we inhale, as we exhale, as we sit with the seat of the back of the chair against our back and our feet on the floor, and we just know that we are in this space with each other, that our identity is here with you. And that we get to share in this journey that is about opening up. It is about discovering. It's about letting go. And in that space, we find hopefully a more true and raw person that you've made. So Father, enlighten us in this journey. Bring us along in this journey. Push us. And may we wake up to a better reality, a more honest reality, a more true reality of who you've made us to be. We love you.